At the recent state banquet, I entrusted Queen Victoria's Oriental Circlet to Catherine, not as decoration, but as a clear mark of the duties she is now called to bear as the future queen of this.
It began as a quiet murmur inside Buckingham Palace, the kind of delicate whisper that usually disappears before it reaches the public. But this time, it didn't fade. It grew. It surged, and within hours, royal insiders were buzzing with the same electrifying claim that King Charles was preparing to elevate Catherine in a way no one saw coming. Not with a title, not with a privilege, but with something far older, far heavier, and far more symbolic than any royal honor given in decades. The sacred crown of Queen Victoria, a piece of history so carefully guarded that even senior royals rarely get close to it, had come into the conversation. And at the center of it all was Catherine, the Princess of Wales, the woman who has become not only the monarchy's stabilizer, but its quiet power. What triggered this sudden shift? According to those closest to the situation, it began during the final planning stages of the Christmas Carol service, an annual tradition that has taken on new weight since Catherine began hosting it. The palace expected a warm, predictable evening of public goodwill. But behind the scenes, something else was unfolding, something that forced Charles to confront not just the public's perception of Catherine, but the future image of the monarchy itself. Catherine had chosen this year's service to speak openly about her health, the ongoing treatment she'd been undergoing, and the profound emotional impact it had on her family. It was a moment of honesty so rare in royal life that it shook the foundations of their media strategy. And according to insiders, it shook Charles personally. Watching her walk into Westminster Abbey, still fragile, yet undeniably regal, Charles reportedly turned to one of his private secretaries and said, "She reminds me of Victoria. Strength under fire." That comparison wasn't casual. Queen Victoria's legacy still casts a shadow across the monarchy, and the crown designed specifically for her, the one forged in 1870, is considered a symbol of endurance, transformation, and the rebirth of the royal image. Charles didn't say more at first, but his staff knew that tone, that distance in his voice. He was thinking, calculating, reevaluating everything he once assumed about his daughter-in-law. Meanwhile, the public response was overwhelming. Catherine's message of resilience spread across the world within minutes. Clips of her speaking stirred an emotional storm, people praising her bravery, her quiet composure, her determination to continue her duties despite the weight she was carrying. And as the praise grew louder, the palace found itself facing a moment it couldn't ignore. Catherine wasn't just popular. She had become the heart of the royal family, the one figure whose authenticity could still unite people in an age of division and scandal. It was in that atmosphere, one filled with vulnerability and admiration, that Charles made his decision. He requested a meeting with the keeper of the royal jewels, a private, off-schedule meeting that raised eyebrows among palace staff. The subject? The availability, preservation status, and ceremonial protocols surrounding Queen Victoria's crown. Because Charles understood the symbolism. He understood the moment. And he understood that Catherine had crossed a threshold, stepping into a role larger than her title, larger even than her duties. In his eyes, she had become the future of the monarchy, and he was prepared to make that future official. But while Charles was quietly laying plans behind locked doors, Catherine herself had no idea what conversations had begun swirling around her name. After the Christmas Carol service ended, she slipped out of the side entrance with William and returned home, exhausted but relieved. She had done what she set out to do: speak honestly, show up for the public, and keep the spirit of the holiday alive despite everything happening behind the scenes. What she didn't expect was the tidal wave waiting for her. Within hours, news outlets across the world weren't just praising her appearance. They were dissecting every gesture, every pause in her speech, every small tremor in her voice. Sympathy, admiration, and speculation merged into one enormous narrative. Catherine wasn't just battling illness, she was carrying the monarchy with her bare hands. Even William, always composed, felt the shift. Royal insiders noticed it immediately. The protective stiffness in his shoulders, the way he hovered close to her during public engagements, as though bracing against a storm he couldn't yet see. And in a way he was right, because across the palace courtyard, in the king's private study, Charles was reconsidering decades of tradition. He had always imagined the next era of the monarchy to unfold gradually, but Catherine's courage had speeded up the clock. Suddenly, the future wasn't a distant concept. It was standing right in front of him, with a warm smile, steady eyes, and unwavering grace. Still, there were complications, major ones. For Charles to associate Catherine with Queen Victoria's crown wasn't just symbolic, it was political. It meant positioning her as the emotional center of the monarchy, the figure who would carry the institution into the next generation. And there were those within the palace who didn't agree. A handful of senior aides whispered concerns. Was it wise to elevate her now, in the middle of treatment? Would it draw unwanted pressure? Would it overshadow the king himself? But Charles dismissed those fears. The monarchy, he believed, had always depended on public trust, and the public trusted Catherine more than anyone else. Meanwhile, the public narrative was becoming impossible to ignore. Social media lit up with fan-made edits comparing Catherine to Queen Victoria, Queen Elizabeth, even Diana. Comment sections overflowed with emotional messages, thousands of people thanking her for speaking openly about her condition. That kind of impact wasn't manufactured. It wasn't planned. It came from genuine connection. And that connection was precisely what Charles needed to safeguard the monarchy's legacy. Late one evening, William was summoned to the king's residence. Reports from palace insiders described the meeting as tense at first, with Charles pacing the room, rehearsing the words he couldn't quite settle on. Finally, he spoke with a kind of raw sincerity that caught William off guard. He told him that Catherine's strength, particularly now, reminded him of the monarchy's greatest leaders. He expressed his belief that she represented something the public desperately needed: stability, hope, and authenticity. Then he explained the symbolic weight of Queen Victoria's crown, how it had been worn at pivotal turning points in royal history. And he admitted that he wanted Catherine to be the next figure associated with it. William listened in silence, absorbing the magnitude of what his father was proposing. It wasn't just an honor, it was a declaration, one that would carve Catherine's place in history with irreversible clarity. At first, he hesitated. He knew Catherine valued her privacy, that she would never seek such recognition. But he also knew she deserved it. And in that room, under the dim golden light of the king's study, William finally nodded. He agreed. Charles exhaled, relieved. The decision was made, and a new chapter of royal history had quietly begun.
But even as father and son aligned on this new vision, Catherine remained unaware of the monumental shift her presence had triggered. She spent the following days surrounded by family, focusing on her treatment schedule and the quiet moments that grounded her, reading with the children, taking short walks when she felt strong enough, and keeping her energy reserved for recovery. She didn't notice the subtle change in William's mood, the way he watched her with the mixture of pride and fierce determination. He had always supported her, but now there was something else in his eyes, an unspoken understanding of the role she was about to step into, whether she realized it or not. Outside the palace walls, the narrative continued to evolve faster than any royal communications team could manage. Commentators noted how Catherine's appearance at the Christmas carol service felt like a resurgence of royal dignity that the monarchy desperately needed. Some newspapers ran headlines calling her the modern monarchy's quiet anchor, while others praised her as the only royal who seemed to understand the emotional expectations of a new generation. The comparisons to Diana intensified as well, not because Catherine mirrored Diana's style or manner, but because she carried the same ability to bridge the gap between the royal world and ordinary people. The difference, however, was that Catherine navigated this role with steadiness instead of turbulence, a calm grace that made her presence feel both familiar and reassuring. Meanwhile, King Charles privately began preparations for the symbolic transition he envisioned. He consulted historians, senior curators, and trusted advisors, each sworn to confidentiality. The idea of pairing Catherine with Queen Victoria's crown wasn't just about continuity. It was about signaling that the monarchy's emotional heart was shifting to a new generation, one that understood vulnerability as strength. And yet, beneath the layers of planning and symbolism, Charles wrestled with something deeply personal, a sense of gratitude toward the daughter-in-law who had stabilized his son, strengthened the public's trust, and carried herself with unwavering dignity, even under immense pressure.
While the king strategized, the online world spiraled into intense discussions. Fan communities posted timelines analyzing how Catherine's influence had quietly grown over the years. Commentators pointed out how she had gracefully evolved from a quiet university student to a future queen who commanded global respect. Even critics struggled to find fault with her handling of the situation. Her honesty created an atmosphere where people felt invested in her recovery, rooting for her not as a royal figure, but as a human being facing an unimaginably difficult chapter. Inside Kensington Palace, however, the atmosphere was softer, calmer. Catherine remained focused on her health, unaware of the political and symbolic movements unfolding around her. William weighed how best to tell her about the king's intentions, knowing she would react with humility before anything else. He could already imagine her expression, a small, shy smile, followed by a quiet acknowledgement that the crown's symbolism, while historic, meant little compared to the work and dedication behind it. And that reaction, William knew, was exactly why she was the perfect figure to carry the monarchy forward. The truth was simple. Catherine had earned respect not through grand gestures, but through her consistency, kindness, and resilience. And as the world continued to watch her journey with empathy and admiration, a realization settled across the palace. The future of the monarchy wouldn't be defined by force or spectacle. It would be shaped by the quiet strength of the woman who, without asking for anything, had already become the heart of it. What no one saw behind Catherine's dazzling entrance was the earthquake it triggered behind palace walls. Because while the world was busy replaying the moment she walked in, crowned with Queen Victoria's sacred heirloom, the royal staff were scrambling to contain the shockwave that rippled across every corridor of Buckingham and Windsor. The tiara wasn't just a fashion choice, it was a message, one that insiders say landed harder than anyone expected. According to staffers who spoke in hushed tones that very night, the moment Catherine appeared in that ruby-studded circle of history, three things happened instantly. Senior courtiers froze, Charles's private advisors exchanged glances, and William didn't stop smiling. But the tension brewing underneath that polished evening was already reaching a breaking point. Because the truth is, this wasn't planned as just another state banquet. Charles, knowing how fragile public confidence can be, especially during his ongoing health challenges, needed a move that reminded Britain who would carry the monarchy into the next era. And instead of saying it outright, he chose to show it. That tiara, reserved for queens and future queens, was the announcement. It was his way of telling the world that Catherine wasn't just stepping up, she was being elevated. And while millions adored it, not everyone inside the palace was thrilled.
Multiple insiders whispered that some senior traditionalists felt blindsided. They believed such a historic piece should remain strictly locked away until the actual coronation. Others muttered that Catherine's rising star was becoming too bright too fast, overshadowing even the king and queen consort. And tension spiked when a senior advisor reportedly asked, "Why now? Why this crown? Why her?" But that question had an even sharper edge behind it, because according to one longtime aide, Charles had refused to let anyone else influence the decision. Not Camilla, not his political advisors, not even members of the Privy Council. He'd made this choice alone, and he stood by it. That independence, rare for a monarch so reliant on counsel, sent shockwaves through the institution.
But the biggest ripple came when Camilla's reaction became the subject of silent speculation. She clapped, she smiled, she played the part flawlessly. But those who know how to read body language said something was off. A stiffness in the shoulders, a half-second delay in applause, a tightness in the jaw when cameras turned away. Sources later revealed she wasn't informed about Charles's tiara choice until hours before the event. Royal watchers couldn't help whispering, was this a passing of symbolic power? A shift in favor? Did the king just signal a future where Catherine's influence surpasses all others? But inside, the atmosphere was much more complicated, because what Charles ignited wasn't just admiration, it was a recalibration of the royal hierarchy, one that everyone in the family now had to navigate carefully. And the next move, it was going to be the most revealing of all.
And so, as the echoes of that historic banquet settle into the marble corridors of Windsor Castle, something unmistakable becomes clear. This wasn't just another royal dinner, nor was Catherine's appearance merely a fashion triumph. It was a calculated, symbolic, and deeply emotional turning point, engineered with precision by a monarchy that understands the power of imagery better than any institution on earth. Catherine didn't just wear Queen Victoria's sacred Oriental circlet. She embodied the continuation of a royal lineage desperately seeking stability in a world increasingly hungry for authenticity. Every ruby, every diamond, every lotus motif on that 172-year-old masterpiece became part of a message that resonated far beyond the banquet hall. It told the world that the future of the monarchy wasn't hypothetical anymore. It had a face, a voice, a presence. Catherine's. Behind palace walls, insiders whispered that King Charles had planned this moment long before the invitations were sent out. His trust in Catherine had grown through the storms of 2024 and 2025, where her resilience became a global symbol of hope. He watched her navigate a terrifying cancer battle with calm sincerity, then return to public life with the grace of someone who understood exactly what the crown demanded: unwavering commitment and quiet strength. By placing Queen Victoria's tiara on her head, a piece once reserved strictly for queens, he wasn't making a fashion statement. He was making a declaration of succession. It was his way of saying, without a single explicit word, that Catherine was no longer just the Princess of Wales. She was the future queen of the United Kingdom, and the monarchy's stability rested firmly in her capable hands. But what truly electrified the public wasn't royal protocol. It was the emotional undercurrent that swept through the night. When Catherine stepped forward beneath the chandelier light, the room fell silent not out of obligation, but awe. This was a woman who had been pushed, tested, scrutinized, and doubted, yet never once allowed the weight of expectation to overshadow her humanity. Her gown shimmered like a midnight sky. Her tiara glowed with the fire of ancient gems. Her posture radiated dignity without arrogance. And in that fusion of history and modernity, spectators felt something they hadn't felt in years: pride, admiration, excitement for what comes next. Across the world, millions watched clips of the moment on their phones, laptops, and TVs. People who hadn't followed the royals in years suddenly found themselves captivated again.
Analysts called her appearance one of the most important visual messages of King Charles's reign. Fashion critics declared it a diplomatic masterpiece. Polls spiked, headlines surged, hashtags exploded. And through it all, Catherine maintained the same composed smile, as though she knew exactly what this night would set into motion. Because in truth, she did. Catherine has always understood the silent language of the monarchy better than most born into it. The crown is not kept alive through grandeur alone, but through the ability to evolve without losing its soul. And Catherine, with her unwavering compassion and her quiet brilliance, has become the embodiment of that delicate balance. This night wasn't the end of a chapter. It was the opening of a new era, one shaped by a woman prepared not only to inherit history, but to elevate it.